It really is difficult to fall in love with games that takes 4 to 5 hours to grind, only to find out you're suddenly in Endgame, where it is the most crucial and one slip can send your whole point away. And you think that's the worst? It sucks even more when you're the one defending. Hello again everyone, today we're just going to look at some of the most quote-unquote basic endgame in chess that can still go horribly wrong and ends up tragic for the defending player. I believe this video will help anyone who in general has a tendency to rush in the endgame and really blunder the whole point away. Now the first game is played between Peter Lecco and Vishy Anand, both a very renowned player. Lecco himself is also a world championship challenger, so doesn't need too much introduction. But in general, if you have a first glance in his position, you'll notice that white is up a pawn by playing Rook takes on a5 and is on the course of winning. Or is he? This is actually far from true. This position is actually a table-based draw. A table-based position is actually a position that is already deemed by many grandmasters to be a drawn positions. Now, provided the one player can actually err, the result can actually digress a lot. But in the end, if both players actually plays perfectly, then the result will not digress away from draws anyway. And so back to the game, the only plan that white can actually use to win the game will be trying to bring this king up to the 7th rank over here, to push this pawn over to 6th rank, and to have the rook blocking the king from checks. For that to happen, the rook has to move away from the A file to B or C file to always keep the king protected from check. We'll see that in the second game, so do stay tuned for that, or just jump to the time step necessary for you to actually understand the second game anyway. As always, timestamp is in the description, but it's black to move and you'll see how Anand actually defends his position. First is bring his king to g7, and after a4, trying to bring his pawn to glory, we see Anand plays rook to d1 check, and after king g2 to bring the rook to a1. And that's it. This is basically how you defend a rook pawn from promoting, or from advancing at least, is to place your rook behind your opponent's territory, behind his opponent's pawn as well. After that, you just want to do nothing in this position. From here on out, you just want to stay put and not do anything, not letting white actually advances with his king and with his pawn. The idea is very simple. If rook to b5 or any other file here, we take the pawn on a4 and this position is basically a draw. No chances here where both pawns are basically still pretty solid on the king's side. So obviously, we keep the white rook stuck here on a file, protecting the pawn, sort of deactivating it if you will. But what if the king were to come to f3? The move we talk about, trying to get a king into the 6th rank to 7th rank and to push the pawn to promotion. The king moves to f3, trying to get this king towards the queen side to the 7th rank where it can push the pawn to promotion. We can even keep the eye on the pawn on f2 by playing rook to a2. Now if white continues with king to e3, for example, we can even play pawn to h5. Just trying to keep an eye on the pawn on a4 and the pawn on f2. Now the question is, what if white does not care anyway? The answer is we don't have to worry. We can even play king to f6, for example, just a waiting move. The idea, if the king persists to run on the queen side, then we can take the pawn on f2, and if the pawn pushes forward, I go rook to f3, trying to gobble up the pawn on g3 instead. The pawn's too slow at the moment, trying to promote, and by the time he moves his pawns to promotion, we'll have won all the pawns on the king's side, and in the end, start to push our pawns on the king's side as well. The sole rook here on a8 and the king that is being shouldered is not enough to stop our pawns immediately. This resulting position will be a draw. So this is basically how you draw a position like this, is to always keep an eye on the pawn that is promoting, but also on the king's side pawns, so that the king won't get involved. And once it gets involved, you always have to counterplay with your pawns of your own. If this position is a dead draw, why do players more often than not keep playing? And as I've discussed, it is all about the chance of your opponent erring. Then white continues with pawn to g4, and after king to f6, a good move to just wait and not change the structure of the position. What advances with king to g3? And even here, black could have just chosen to play rook to a3, stay put, stay protecting the a pawn for promoting, also looking at the king side pawn at the moment. And after pawn a3, rook to a1 is a possibility. Instead, Vishy Anand plays rook to c1. This gets a bit tricky. Now allows white to actually play rook to b5, the move we don't want to happen because the pawns simply push forward. Now the thing is, it would have been fine if black would just chosen to play rook to a1 over here and our king to g7. Both are actually good in not changing the structure and actually just wait for white to offer a draw. Instead, what Anand did was a jaw-dropping move of pawn to g5. Now this move does not lose the game straight away, but it is one of the crucial mistakes, one of the heaviest mistakes that Anand can do in this game, to actually just let this opponent play rook to f5 check. One way to make progress, and after king to g6, pawn to h5. As you can see, letting white have some progress on the king's side. Well, now the rook is actually protecting the pawn on f2 as well. So if the king wants to rush to the queen's side, it can. In this position after king to g7 and pawn to f5, it is crucial for black to play rook to c4. The idea of which, of course, if white plays king to f3, we stay along the a4 line, so when the king step away, we can gobble up this pawn on g4, and if pawn to f3 trying to protect this pawn on g4, then the engine wants rook to c2. I suppose everyone sees the genius idea of blocking the king so that he will not be actually having an access to go to the queen side. That's pretty much easy. It is also very feasible in terms of getting the draw and stopping the pawn at the same time. But the idea of the move rook to c4 only to follow it up with rook to c2 is probably too difficult for human to detect anyway. A non-final plays rook to a1, thinking it's probably okay and still enough to stop this pawn. But this allows white to actually go about his plan to bring his king to the queen side, and even here in this position where after king f8, white has the luxury of playing rook to b6, trying to exchange off the rook. Obviously if rook takes, the pawn takes, the king will have a difficult time to actually stop this pawn. Too late, pawn will promote. So after rook to b6, we do see rook to e5 trying to, let's say, decline the exchange, and after a6, a7, but then it's too late. Even though the rook's now behind the opponent's pawn, it is on the 7th rank, and one push is all it needs to actually just promote. And white did not hesitate to bring his king and to lose all his pawns on the king's side, because it is not rather than no more. And in this position, where white has successfully moved his king to protect this pawn, black resign. Now you will think that this position is table-based draw, and it's just going to be smooth for players who actually draw this, sign the score sheet and go home. But no, the most challenging part of this game, or in the endgame, is to sit tight. The word sit tight, and not play a move like g5 to actually change the structure of your game. That is very important, but also very often missed by players, especially when you're 6-7 hours into the endgame and you're probably very exhausted. You also think that this game is played in 2003 and so probably it's not relevant anymore. Players are getting stronger and smarter, they will not blunder the same mistake again. But a second game played in 2021 showed otherwise. Now I'm pretty sure you actually recognize this position, as it has just been played in the FIDE Grand Prix 2021. The game is even heavily discussed all over the internet and on YouTube, and so if you haven't seen any of this, it means you're not following Top Chess after all. But in any case, in the second game, provides us a similar feature of the game we saw in the first one, but this time, white has all the hypothetical position that we saw in the first game. White first plays pawn to a5 and after king to g7, a6, and then rook to a3, getting the rook behind this pawn on a6 to stop it from promotion. Classic, right? But Firouzja here plays king to g3, again with the same idea of getting the king activated, and who knows, he might bring the king to the queen side and supporting this pawn to promote. Now I continue the very sensible move rook to a2, same idea. If the king were to move up and to leave the g2 square, the pawn falls, and with that, black's pawn will actually march us forward, and it's not clear at all who will win this position. So it kinda stopped white in advancing his king for a bit. Except, it does not. Firouzja plays pawn to f4, indicating the idea of gf4 and king f4. I don't care if I lose the pawn on g2, I'm rushing my king up forward with the idea to get my king in front of my rook so you can't check me, and I support this pawn to promote. But now it is just as we said, black now has an asset, which is a pawn here on f-file and potentially h-file. And so he correctly again pushes pawn to f5, and after king to c7, f4, king b8, pawn to f3, has to push your own assets, you know. Unfortunately, after a7, f2, seems like both sides getting to promote, but white lands a final challenge and test. He plays rook to b1, guarding the promotion square from the pawn, and threatened to actually promote on his own. It is important to factor in the time that each player has at the moment. It is black to move and he has about 20 minutes over here. He spent about 13 to play the move pawn to f1, queen. This is akin to throwing your assets away. You can see the following commentary that Firouzja provided.
Certainly Russia. It was a long game, lots of ups and downs. Congratulations on your victory. Would you summarize the key moments in your view of the game?
And then the game was very equal, and then at some point in time trouble he made some mistake, and then there was this end game. But yeah, the end game is always very tricky because I am pawn up, and he made a mistake at the end, but I think it was draw.
Yeah, you allowed his f-pawn to go down the line and
Yes.
sort of keep the balance.
Yes, I think there he had to not sacrifice the pawn, the f-pawn. He had to go with the king, but it's only about pure calculation, and he calculate pretty well, so yeah, I was kind of lucky also.
It is not necessary to actually throw away the pawn at all. Instead, black could have done king to g6, just getting the king into the game. Remember, in the first game we talked about how the king and a pawn being very important, working together to actually secure us a draw, or even a win if your opponent blunders, that is. But even after rook to f1, we can even just try rook to b2 check, where if the king move, we move back to a file trying to kill this pawn, and this position will be a draw by repetition anyway. You say, what if white promotes to the queen? Then we of course take on a file, and we still match up our king to actually support this pawn on f2 to promote. Even after rook to f1, I can go king h4. This resulting position where you have a rook pawn like this and the king is too far away, you are drawing this position. And so hot tip, if you actually ever find yourself in this position, don't ever resign, play on. It is a draw. You can play it out at home, but there's no way that white can actually break through and have a win this position. But black still has an asset here on h2 that he can promote. Instead, what Nair did was queen to f1, giving away the asset. And after rook to f1, I don't know what he was thinking, but probably he was thinking that he has rook to b2. And after king c8 comes to a file, the rook has no way to get to a file or protecting this pawn from falling. Also, if the king just moves to a8, then supposedly there's nothing to worry about. But then we get a classic idea to get the rook to the 7 rank, the king on the 8, to protect the king from being checked. And after king moves to b file, we can promote the pawn. Black tries to gobble out the h pawn, but in this particular case, there's nothing that white can do to stop this pawn from promoting. And in this position, black resign. Obviously because white is going to get a new queen and black's going to be too late. So that is also a big miss by Nair in 2021 against the rising star Firouzja. Now to show you how it's really done, I've prepared a classic game from the early 1980s between Viktor Korchnoi and Robert Hübner. If you're not familiar with these two players, a world championship challenger to Anatoly Karpov, and Robert Hübner is basically one of the top player, one of the elite in Fischer-Karpov timeline. And so still clash with the titans right here. But the essence is the same. White is up a pawn and black's the one who is going to defend this position. And he defends it with rook to d8. Active defense. You're not afraid of rook to c7 because you have rook to d2. Aiming at this pawn instead. If black plays something like rook to a8 or b8, this will be known as passive defense because white can play rook to c7 anyway and try to bring his queen to squeeze all the pawns on the queen side later on. So as a chess player in endgame, you do not want to do that. You always want to defend your position with active defense with something like rook to d8. The idea of active defense is to actually defend your position while trying to cripple down your opponent's pieces as well. Now rook c4 as continuation, and after rook to d2, rook to b4, still protecting the pawn on the queen side, doesn't want to drop it. King g7, king g2, king g6, rook to b5, so actually very classic, getting our king all the way to the center if possible, trying to stop his king from actually having any kind of progress. So far so good from Hübner. And after rook to b5 from white, Hübner plays pawn to f5. So nothing wrong here. a3, rook c2, king g3. And after rook to d2, h4, and king to f6. So you can see black's not rushing to do anything or to change the structure of the game. He's basically just staying put because he knows it's the draw at the end of the day. And if white tries to walk forward, he's going to ignore the pawn on the back side. So very nice vision by Robert Hübner. At the pawn a4, king g6 and b4, we do see black still shuffle around with the rook and the king, not changing any structure at all. So this is what you have to strive for whenever you encounter yourself in this kind of position. King f4, rook takes f2 as we said. Now there's a fine line. If rook takes f5 in this position, one actually loses to a very simple tactic, and that is rook to f3 check. The king is forced to take or to step away, and after king takes on f5, white is ending this on the wrong foot. He lets his opponent's king get into his territory. After king to g3, there's h5 and so on. White's the one that is going to be kaput in this position. And so carefully place pawn to a5, and after the exchange, to grab this f5 pawn only when the rook has moved away from the f-file. And in this position where there's not enough material for black or for white to push for a win, Hübner goes h5 and, take on f-pawn, not worrying that he lost the last pawn, because in the end of the day he was able to stay put and stay close to the pawn from promoting. In this position, the game is a draw. That is nothing that white can do anyway, because if the king were to move closer, then rook check, and after king to b7, we keep checking and keep protecting this pawn. Even if the pawn runs to a7, we can rest assured that this pawn will never promote. Again, remember the king and the rook kind of have to switch place. The rook has to be on the b file and the king has to be on the a file. And so if you take a look at this position, this will be winning for white if we switch it up a bit. But just because the king is outside and the rook has nowhere to move, anytime it moves, the a pawn falls, this position is a draw. And so excellent defense from Hübner there. This is basically how you defend a position with the rook pawn down. So remember the key 3 steps: getting your king in, bringing your rook behind enemy's pawn, and stay put. And so now that you have watched this video until the end, it is a crime from now on to lose this kind of endgame. Hopefully you keep that inside your head. As usual, if you enjoyed, please press the like button. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.